Chicagoans, more than most other residents of American cities, learn early in their lives of the devastating fire that all but destroyed the center and surrounding parts of the fast growing metropolis of the Midwest in the Great Fire of 1871. Those who were old enough to remember, or had otherwise learned of the destruction it caused, must have been bewildered that a fire in a downtown theater some 32 years later should bring death to more than twice as many souls as then, despite the many improvements in construction, furnishings, and safety measures that had been made since that time. From the perspective of those who had been members of the fire department in 1871 and later, it was especially unimaginable that the person in command of the first fire engine crew to put water on the blaze that started in the barn behind the O'Leary home on DeKoven Street should in 1901 have become the marshal in charge of what was by then a force of 1,273 men who operated 90 engines and various other apparatus. The turn of the 20th century held bright promise for the United States, as the successful conclusion of the Spanish-American War foretold a growing role for the nation in world affairs. In 1900, President William McKinley won re-election with a young new running mate and hero of the war, who was also making a name for himself as a reformer, determined to put limits on the power of major industrialists. When 42-year-old Theodore Roosevelt suddenly became president upon McKinley's assassination in 1901, his exuberance and the goals he began setting for the country were a timely reflection of the nation's potential. A clear example of its innovative and productive capacity had been exhibited only a few years earlier when Chicago's bid to host a World's Fair was chosen by the federal government above all others. Having risen from the ashes of a conflagration that destroyed a major part of the city in 1871, Chicago quickly rebounded through the efforts of its leading businessmen and others who recognized the ongoing value of its location as a center of commerce. With railroads already linking the city to many parts of the country, it only took a little extra wind from the Windy City boosters to ensure Chicago would be the site of the fair. Most of us have learned it was this kind of wind, or hot air as we might call it today, rather than the breeze from Lake Michigan, which was how the city actually got its nickname. The population had already reached about 300,000 in 1870 when businessman Potter Palmer, having bought property on State Street, had it widened and made into the city's main shopping street. That year he also married beautiful and refined Bertha Honore, who was less than half his 44 years of age. The hotel he opened on State at Quincy Street barely a year later was seen as a gift to Bertha on their first anniversary. Like so much else, however, it too succumbed to the ravages of the Great Fire. A new Palmer House Hotel, the city's central core, and industrial plants sprang up almost overnight after the fire as innovative architects poured into Chicago, anxious to try out new designs and methods of construction for those with the finances to create sturdier and ever taller commercial structures. New homes, big and small, also arose. In 1882, the Palmers began building a castle-like mansion facing the lake on the near north side, leading to the establishment of a new neighborhood that would come to be known as the Gold Coast because of the homes other wealthy industrialists chose to build there. Civic pride also led to a decision to create a facility for use by Chicagoans of all backgrounds that would stand out for its beauty and architectural excellence. The result was undoubtedly the finest public structure ever to rise in the heart of the city, which was a result of the Great Fire itself. When the city burned in 1871, word of the conflagration quickly spread throughout the world. Among those offering aid was Queen Victoria, who assumed that the fire must have destroyed the city's public library. To help stock a new one, she and other prominent Brits collected some 8,000 books to send here. Besides the Queen, donors included Charles Darwin, Robert Browning, John Stuart Mill, and Alfred Lord Tennyson. Although Chicago didn't have a public library at the time, the donations from abroad gave civic leaders a strong incentive to create one, which was organized in April of 1872. A plan was then devised that would allow two publicly financed institutions to be represented in a new building at the same site, which was then a park on Michigan Avenue between Randolph and Washington Streets. The state legislature owned the northern quarter of the park, where it wanted to create a memorial to Illinois veterans of the Civil War, while the city chose to build a public library on the rest. It took until 1891 for an agreement to be approved by both, resulting in the creation of what became the Grand Army of the Republic Memorial Hall, occupying an entire upper floor at the north end of the building, and a public library most of the rest. The rest is hardly an adequate way to describe the magnificent Washington Street entrance to what came to be called the People's Palace. Millions of tiny pieces of white marble mosaics were used to decorate the walls and ceilings with the names of famous American writers and poets. What we know today as the Cultural Center's Preston Bradley Hall was once the library's receiving room, where ordinary citizens waited for books to be brought to them while sheltered under a 38-foot wide Tiffany glass dome. It was the grandeur of this structure, which was opened in 1897 after 5 years of construction, that set a standard of excellence for anything that followed, such as the new theater, whose owners aimed at making it the finest and most lavishly decorated in the Midwest, if not the country. Between the time the construction of the library began and when it opened, another major event drew national and world attention to Chicago. Throughout Jackson Park and what became known as the Midway, the World's Columbian Exposition took place that included hundreds of exhibits displayed in temporary stucco structures making up what was called the White City. One of them was a building displaying products made by women, which Bertha Palmer promoted and made sure would be designed by a female architect. Some 27 million visits were recorded as entrance through the turnstiles at the fair during its nearly 6-month run, which obviously included many of the same people, since most would have made several visits to make their stay worth the effort it took to get there. The visitors included ordinary folks as well as potentates. Queen Victoria's eldest son, who became King Edward VII upon her passing in 1901, as well as the daughter of the King of Spain, were among those who visited and were honored guests of the Palmers at elaborate dinners they hosted at their mansion. By that time, the Palmers were already known in the royal courts and highest societies of Europe through their patronage of the arts and through friends or relatives who had married members of the nobility. Bertha was one of the first Americans to recognize the value of Impressionist art and purchased scores of paintings produced by Renoir, Monet, Manet, and others, which ultimately became top attractions at the Art Institute. It was the growing recognition of Chicago as Midwest America's center of commerce and cultural life that the Palmers, the Marshall Fields, and others spread through their sophistication and acumen, which led to our way of doing business taking root abroad. Harry Selfridge, for instance, opened what became a leading London department store by adopting practices he learned while working for Marshall Fields and hired Chicago architect and city planner Daniel Burnham to design the store on Oxford Street. As part of its growing fame as a business and cultural center, Chicago from early on became home to a number of theaters. The first permanent theater was established in the converted dining room of the Sauganash Hotel in 1837, the year of the city's incorporation, when the population was barely 4,000. Ironically, when the managers wanted to move the theater to a building closer to the center of the business district, a group of businessmen protested to the city council, asking for it not to grant a license because, quote, theaters are subject to take fire and are believed to be dangerous on that account to property in their vicinity, unquote. Apparently, this admonition was never taken all that seriously, and the first theater, said to be patronized by respectable Chicagoans, was opened by John B. Rice on Dearborn between Randolph and Washington Streets in 1847. As luck would have it, the first performance there was of a Bellini opera that was interrupted by cries of fire outside. When Rice himself stepped to the front of the stage and shouted for the audience to, quote, sit down. Do you think I would permit a fire to occur in my theater? Unquote. They actually did take their seats, but not for long. Minutes later, the theater caught fire from a blaze that had originated in a stable across the alley, but all evacuated safely. Of all the theaters built through the end of the Civil War, Chicago's finest was Crosby's Opera House on Washington, mid-block west of State Street, reportedly costing $700,000 to build and furnish. It was the work of architect William W. Boyington, who also designed the Chicago Water Tower and pumping station, among many other structures. Bad timing had plagued the opening of the Opera House, which was to have taken place on April 17, 1865. When Abraham Lincoln was shot only days earlier at Ford's Theater in Washington, Uriah Crosby's grand celebration had to be postponed. Once the house did open, it had somewhat of a questionably uplifting series of performances, but was ultimately successful enough that Crosby spent $100,000 to modernize and redecorate the place in the summer of 1871, scheduling a grand reopening for October 9th, with a series of 10 symphony and popular concerts by Theodore Thomas and his orchestra, which ultimately became the Chicago Symphony. October 9th, 1871, turned out to be another inauspicious day for Chicago. 2 days earlier, firemen spent 17 hours putting out a fire that caused $1 million in damage across 4 square blocks just west of the river, north of Adams Street. The next night, the barn behind Patrick and Catherine O'Leary's house on DeKoven Street caught fire, leading to the conflagration that burned about a third of the city, taking some 300 lives. With that nightmare, almost 30 years passed at the dawn of the 20th century, as motor cars and flying machines were in their infancy. Few would have believed that anything so costly in terms of human life could ever again cause such trauma to the city. Yet it happened, and one of those whose efforts to control the Great Fire of 1871 made him a hero to many, appears to have failed the test he faced many years later as a leader to encourage those under his command to bring their concerns to superior officers about anything they felt could affect public safety that needed to be acted upon. Although it wasn't published until 100 years later, a lengthy work about the Iroquois Theater fire by Anthony P. Hatch provides a comprehensive review of what led up to and resulted in the catastrophe that doomed so many, under the title Tinderbox. It is from his portrayal of the catastrophe and how it played out that most of what is being presented here is based. Significant accounts were also taken from Marshall Everett's The Great Chicago Theater Disaster, which was published in 1904. Chicagoans weren't the only people the creators of the Iroquois Theater were able to impress with their plans for the grandiose theater being built around the still-standing Delaware Building on the northeast corner of Randolph and Dearborn Streets. Illustrated with a drawing of the entrance to the proposed structure, the San Francisco Chronicle featured a headline announcing, "Chicago to have a palatial theater," when the cornerstone was laid on July 28th of 1903. The owners were identified as Will J. Davis and Harry Powers of Chicago, Claw and Erlanger of New York, and Nixon and Zimmerman of Philadelphia. The architect chosen for the project was 28-year-old Chicago-born Benjamin H. Marshall, who would go on to design the Blackstone, Drake, and Edgewater Beach hotels, as well as apartment buildings as 179 East Lakeshore Drive, 1200 North Lakeshore Drive, and 1555 North State Parkway, among other iconic structures in the city. It would later be said of his involvement with the Iroquois that he, quote, sacrificed function and safety for the sake of form and flash, unquote. Yet neither Marshall nor others involved with the project were ever held criminally liable for the theater's fate. The L-shaped layout of the new theater was unusual in that instead of being built directly north behind the entrance on Randolph, the stage was parallel to Dearborn Street. This meant that access to parquet or main floor seating was through doors opening to the southernmost seats in rows facing the stage to the left. This also applied to seats on the upper levels, including the private boxes on the mezzanine level and those above. The stage itself was enormous, measuring 60 feet wide and 110 feet deep. It was claimed that no obstructions blocked the view from any of the 1,600 audience seats. More than $1 million were said to have been spent on the theater's furnishings, which included ornate chandeliers, mirrored walls, and painted wall panels surrounded by plush velvet draperies. Plush velvet was also used to cover audience seats, which had hemp stuffings, as did settees around the promenade and landings. During this period, endeavors of this kind were frequently advertised with superlatives, whether deserved or not, and young Benjamin Marshall was as ready as anyone to use them. Of the Iroquois, he said, quote, "No expense or precaution must be omitted to make this theater fireproof," unquote. He said 25 exits were included in his design of the theater, and that it could be emptied in no more than 5 minutes. In reality, however, many of the Iroquois exits remained unmarked, and some of those on the upper levels had been designed to lead to fire escapes that were never built. The February 1904 edition of New York's The Theater magazine reported that, quote, only 6 of the Iroquois exits were in working order, and that they were concealed by curtains and had no red lamps to guide the way out, unquote. It also said, quote, there was no fire alarm in the entire house, no sprinkler on the stage, no flue to carry off smoke and flame, men absent from duty, green substitutes in charge of dangerous lights, and so on, until one stands aghast at how any manager was willing to incur the risk of inviting audiences into his theater, unquote. One could also ask how any city official whose duty it was to approve of measures in structures designed for occupancy by large audiences could also fail to prevent its use before such blatant defects were corrected. Yet it happened in the very city that experienced destruction on a massive scale, intensified by some of those same defects only a few decades earlier. The late July groundbreaking for the Iroquois left little time to waste for such a project to be completed in order to gain enough publicity to pack the house during the upcoming year-end holiday season. So it was no wonder that the originally planned mid-October opening had to be postponed when labor issues delayed the proposed date. Yet within that time, many steps to bring the theater up to the high standards its owners and operators had so blatantly flaunted were left unfinished in the rush to fill its 1,600 seats with as many customers as possible and begin receiving returns on the huge investments that were made to bring them in. Combined with some other unfortunate practices of the period, it led to a tragedy that few could ever have imagined. Sadly, the few who did recognize the potential for disaster weren't able to have their concerns acted upon. One was Patrick Jennings, the captain of the fire department's Engine 13, which was stationed on Dearborn Street, only a block north of the Iroquois, and would be the first fire company to respond to any fire there. Jennings visited the Iroquois just days before the theater's delayed opening on November 23rd. He was joined by William Salers, a retired fireman who was hired to serve as the house fireman and was required to be present for every performance there. It is not clear whether any previous official inspections had been made of the building, but there certainly should have been, one or more, to recognize the obvious safety issues Jennings found. Among the many shortcomings he noticed were the lack of exit signs in the auditorium and exits that were hidden by thick drapery. Backstage, he could find no telephone, fire alarm, or sprinkler systems, no fire buckets, and inadequate lengths of fire hose. The only firefighting devices Jennings did find were 6 2-foot-long canisters containing a dry chemical called Killfire. According to the attached instructions, these were to be forcibly thrown in a fan-like arc at the base of flames. Furious at what he had seen, Jennings pressed Sellers to explain why he didn't bring these shortcomings to the management's attention. Sellers said he was afraid he might lose his job if he raised objections, and that management had been aware of the problems for some time. Jennings found himself in the same position as Sellers when he reported his findings to Jack Hannon, chief of the fire department's 1st Battalion, who shared quarters with Engine 13 on Dearborn Street. When Jennings told the chief that, quote, "If a fire ever starts on that stage, it will be frightful," unquote. The reported response was, quote, "What can we do about it? They have a fireman there and know all about it," unquote. These reactions could be attributed to the prevailing civil service employees' awareness at the time, which was that failing to accept what a superior officer told you and trying to get the issue resolved by someone else would doom any chances for any future promotion, and you might as well start looking for another job. Here, it meant that fear of losing one's job took priority over requiring action that might have saved hundreds of lives. Ironically, the same person might have been recognized as a hero if the theater's opening had been delayed again so the incomplete safety measures could be acted upon, and there still had been a fire that was quickly controlled before any real damage could be done. Instead, in one of the Windy City's windiest advertisements, plans for the grand opening of the Iroquois on November 23rd went ahead with no further effort to include the safety of those attending the theater. A full-page ad in the Chicago Tribune announced that, quote, "The initial performance will be Claw and Erlanger's stupendous production of the Great Drury Lane Extravaganza, The climax of spectacular magnificence, Mr. Bluebeard. No resident of Chicago, imbued with the proper amount of local pride, can afford to miss the dedicatory performance of the best theater on earth. Chicago always leads. Biggest, brightest, and best in every other way, it now has the theater to correspond. Unquote. As overdone as this kind of promotion would seem today, the theater's opening as a social event drew a sophisticated crowd of the city's elite. Among the formally dressed in attendance were John G. Shedd, accompanied by his wife and daughter, who would succeed Marshall Field to head the department store and would later endow the city's planetarium. Others included Robert Hall McCormick of the McCormick Reaper family and George and Charles Plomondon, owners of a major machinery plant. A number of first-nighters had participated in an auction a few days earlier where box seats for opening night at the Iroquois had reportedly gone for as much as $225 each. The production of Mr. Bluebeard, with Eddie Foy in the lead role, was a precursor of a new kind of musical comedy, but it was an expensive investment, costing $150,000. Of this, $65,000 was for the sets, costumes, and special effects. Actors and dancers, some of whom had performed with the show in London, included Nellie Reed, a young aerial ballerina. In one daring act, she was drawn out over the audience, harnessed to a nearly invisible wire. Altogether, the advertised Chicago cast of 400 included musicians, stagehands, carpenters, electricians, and wardrobe attendants, among others. The first significant snow of the season had fallen on the city on November 5th, followed by cold and rain, which also affected the Fuller Construction Company's completion of work on the theater, as did a transit workers' strike on November 14th. According to Hatch, Abraham Erlanger, of the theatrical trust that controlled most of what went on the stages of New York and Chicago, had pressed his Davis and Powers Chicago partners to speed up construction of the Iroquois so it could be opened in time for the lucrative fall theater season, even if it meant handing out free tickets or persuading in some other way whoever might be responsible for issuing the permits needed to open the place to the public. While the New York critics had generally been positive about the show's premiere there in January of 1903, its delayed opening in Chicago toward the end of the year elicited disappointment. The Evening Post decried it, claiming, "Nothing sadder than the dialogue of this affair has been encountered in the realm of burlesque for long years." Although the critic liked the quick costume changes, he panned Bonnie Magnan, the local actress and lead dancer, saying, "Bonnie Magnan is no more. She of the nimble toe has grown stout. The result is more or less deplorable." The Chicago American complained that there was so much chorus and so little principle that Mr. Bluebeard could have gone along fairly well even if Mr. Foy had stayed at home and all the other principals had been indisposed. While the Tribune praised the theater, its critics said of the play, "Of story there is little or none, and the music of the piece is hopelessly common, save bits here and there which are filched from the classics." The Journal, on the other hand, liked Foy and predicted that 2 or 3 of its catchy songs will probably be heard on the streets soon. Despite the critics, with local school children and college students home for the holidays between Christmas and New Year's, the Wednesday in between was considered by many parents to be an ideal time for all to enjoy the offerings of a glamorous and much publicized new theater. So more tickets were sold for the December 30th matinee production of Mr. Bluebeard than the seating that was actually available. Of the 1,602 listed as the Iroquois' official seating capacity, about 700 were in the more expensive parquet or main floor section behind the orchestra pit. Something more than 400 were in the first balcony, or what was called the dress circle, and just 500 were in the upper gallery. 4 of the high-end lower boxes were designed to seat 6, and 2 of the upper boxes were intended to hold 4 apiece, but the owners managed to fit 8 chairs into each box. More than 200 standees were said to have bought tickets for the Wednesday matinee performance on December 30th, squeezed in behind the last rows of the balcony and gallery. Echoes of the past could be heard that same Wednesday afternoon at City Hall, where Fire Marshal William Musham, one of the veterans of the fire of 1871, was in his office. He was there to discipline 6 firemen who had gone over his head to report issues they were concerned about in their jobs to fire insurance company officials after not being able to persuade their superior officers to act upon them. Musham had been widely praised for his service during the fire of 1871, when he was in charge of the first engine company on the scene of the fire in the O'Leary's barn on DeKoven Street. From there, he worked more than 2 days with practically no sleep in the face of winds that ultimately helped create a conflagration. By the time he became fire marshal, some 3 decades later, however, he didn't seem to have the tact and executive ability to lead a department of 1,273 men operating some 90 engines, 27 hook and ladder companies, and various other apparatus. It had been a seasonably cold wintry day in Chicago, but the prospect of being able to attend the matinee performance of a much talked about musical comedy with a lead role played by locally raised Eddie Foy more than made up for conditions outside. The setting alone was worth the price. Descriptions of the opulence of the new theater having been heavily publicized and praised by many who had attended the show since opening day some 5 weeks earlier. As Foy awaited the start of the show, he looked out from backstage and saw the house was not only packed, but that he had never seen so many women and children in attendance. He probably couldn't have been fully aware that people were not only standing 4 deep in designated areas behind the last rows of seats, but were sitting in the aisles and standing along the walls on both sides of the auditorium, which was against regulations. What was standard procedure, at least in the newest theater operated by Will Davis, was that when the house lights dimmed to signal the start of the first act, young ushers were to lock or bolt most of the doors leading from the balcony and gallery to prevent those in the upper tiers from sneaking down into the more expensive seats below. For this particular performance, it was apparent that there were no seats to be taken. It was also true that some of the door bolts were made in Europe and were unfamiliar to Americans. Even more of a hazard, and to everyone's later chagrin, practically all the exit doors from the theater were designed to open inward rather than outward. The first act of Mr. Bluebeard ended with a spectacular tableau featuring a stage full of women and children in fairy costumes, which appeared to be a great success. The intermission provided many of those in attendance with the opportunity to visit elegantly furnished lounges, relax on the plush settees, or mingle with others in the promenade of the highly praised new theater, which was a showplace in itself. Those in the balcony and gallery, confined to the area behind locked and bolted doors, were still able to enjoy the upstairs promenade and surrounding amenities. With the second act underway at around 3:15 in the afternoon, ballet aerialist Nellie Reed was wearing a specially designed costume which was attached on the back to a wire allowing her to appear to fly out over the audience. This sequence was made all the more spectacular by the use of hundreds of colored lights, some of which were concealed inside metal reflectors on both sides of the stage. Although the lights were not needed for the moonlight number, a member of the stage crew neglected to completely retract the reflector on the right side of the stage, leaving it extended somewhat in the path of the stage curtains. A carbon arc lamp that was used to illuminate the scene was positioned on a light bridge about 15 feet above the stage and within about a foot of the drop curtains. Powerful enough to generate a temperature as high as 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit, the arc lamp was the only spotlight used to illuminate the double octet set of actors performing a number entitled "Let Us Swear It by the Pale Moonlight." As the male actors were beginning to assemble on stage, the spotlight began to sputter and spark. After emitting a slight crackling sound, a few inches of orange flame appeared and began to spread out slowly along the fringe of one of the stage curtains. William McMullen, an assistant electrician in charge of the spotlight, tried slapping the flame with his hands, but practically within seconds the flame grew, burning the material above his head beyond his reach, and was beginning to catch on the heavier curtains. He shouted to the stagehand on the catwalk above to help put it out, but he too only used his hands and was no more successful in his efforts. While the double octet began to dance below, the flames grew larger, were beyond reach, and were starting to emit black smoke. A flash of light appeared where a 110-volt line connected to the spotlight McMullen had been controlling, and almost immediately a curtain swayed against the flames and was ablaze. At about this time, William Solers, the house fireman, was making his way upstairs from the basement dressing rooms. Seeing the flames, he pulled some tubes of kill fire from their wall hooks, climbed the vertical steps up the light bridge, and began tossing the powder up at the growing blaze. It had little effect. The flames were beyond his reach. Learning of the situation while in his dressing room, Eddie Foy rushed to the stage to try to calm the audience, where some were beginning to notice the commotion backstage. The orchestra, meanwhile, continued to play on, muffling the shouts and the faint ringing of bells backstage, calling for the asbestos curtain to be dropped. It wasn't before long that the musicians themselves were becoming rattled. A violinist had seen the fire from the start and motioned to the other musicians to play faster, hoping that too would help calm the audience. Looking back between quick views of the notes on his sheet music, the violinist could see the fire spreading. Soon the bassoon player put down his instrument and exited through the orchestra pit door. Other musicians quickly followed. By now, some members of the audience at every level of the theater were able to see fires in the stage area that were obviously more than dramatic effects, and began leaving their seats, heading toward what they thought would be exits. The young ushers who had locked the gates at the upper levels were nowhere to be found, having been instructed to unlock the gates in those areas only at the end of performances. At the worst possible moment, the situation became truly critical when the fire on stage reached the power control box, which also controlled the house lights, leaving only the growing flames to illuminate the rest of the theater. With the fire now consuming the backdrops hanging over the stage from the rafters, the fire curtain couldn't be lowered all the way because it was blocked by a spotlight that wasn't pulled back far enough. The fate of many in the audience was sealed when a stage door was left open by those who had used it to escape the flames. The resulting blast of air blew the flames out from the stage under what had been left of the flimsy fire curtain and right over the audience. Included in its path of death was the hapless aerialist Nellie Reed, who perished while still attached to the wire that had allowed her virtually to fly over those seated below. With not even a telephone inside the Iroquois to use to call for help, a stagehand ran to the firehouse of Engine 13, known to be close by on Dearborn Street, where he found pipeman Michael J. Corrigan on watch and cried out that the theater was on fire. Corrigan immediately sounded the bell to alert everyone in the house that they had to respond, but rather than wait for the horses to be hitched and both the steam pumper and hose wagon to charge out of the house, he ran down the street to help what he knew would be hundreds trying to escape the theater. A box alarm was pulled once the fire alarm office learned it was the Iroquois that was on fire, which would bring additional engine and hook and ladder companies to the scene, along with higher ranking officials to direct the efforts of all those responding. When the alarm was sounded, the department's chief officer, William H. Musham, was in his City Hall office, as previously noted, which was then in a building on LaSalle between Randolph and Washington that was separate from and adjacent to the county building just to the east. He and the 6 firemen who were with him all ran to the theater, which was little more than a block to the east on Randolph Street. As soon as they got there, Musham took charge and began directing the strategies of arriving fire companies, while the others did what they could to lead whoever they could find inside to safety. Most, if not all, the fire companies shown on the 3 levels of alarms for Box 26 were dispatched to a scene their crews must have wished they had never witnessed, though the fire itself was extinguished in less than half an hour. The 5 engine companies per alarm are shown on the left, with ladder trucks in the middle and battalion chiefs on the right. In one incident that may also have been experienced by others, a fireman carrying out the body of a young girl was stopped by Musham, who ordered him to give her to someone else and go back to help find those who might still be alive. With tears running down his face, the fireman kept going, saying, "I'm sorry, Chief, I've got a girl like this at home. I want to carry this one out." As the bells of responding fire apparatus rang out through surrounding streets, Chicago's police chief, Francis O'Neill, hurried to the theater with Assistant Chief Shuttler after ordering captains from a dozen district stations to bring their men to the theater. Upon arriving there, O'Neill led his patrolmen up the stairs to the landing outside the east entrance to the first balcony, where they struggled to remove some of the bodies that had piled up there, where panic-stricken victims were trampled trying to escape through blocked exits. Once the flames spread out over the parquet-level seats and up into the gallery and balcony levels, people in all parts of the theater began crying out for help or the names of companions they had been separated from in the darkness while fighting to find exits that weren't clearly marked or didn't exist where they were thought to be. Meanwhile, ballet aerialist Nellie Reed, with the harness on the back of her costume still connecting her to a wire that allowed her to virtually fly out over the audience, was left helplessly dangling. The technician who had controlled her movements had been distracted by what was happening on stage. When her dress caught fire, it reportedly burned like paper. There was nothing she could do to save herself. The fire actually lasted only a short time, estimated at less than half an hour, but within that period, hundreds died, either from being asphyxiated by the smoke, trampled to death after falling under others scrambling desperately to escape, or by not being able to get through locked exits or beyond those that opened inward. Converging stairways and a mirrored door that was thought to be an exit contributed to many of the fatalities. About 200 perished in a passageway leading to what turned out to be a hidden exit. Some of the exits that did exist at the higher levels of the theater were not marked as such, and at least one led to what was supposed to be a fire escape that had yet to be built. Some innovative students at a Northwestern University building across an alley from the theater improvised a way to rescue people from an upper level exit of the burning structure that was intended to lead to that non existent fire escape. They found a ladder that could reach the distance between both buildings, allowing several from the theater to escape the burning structure. Some, trying to make their way across, lost their grip or balance on the ladder and fell to their death on the pavement below. Others, falling after them, survived with injuries when bodies already on the alley cushioned their falls. All too many never made it out, perishing as they fell under the weight of others and became stacked as high as the door frames they had been trying to push through. Others were found with parts of their clothing torn off in the rush to escape, or were burned beyond recognition. The dead were placed in rows on both sides of the entrance to the theater, covered with blankets brought from nearby department stores to await identification by grieving relatives. According to a report of January 8, 1904, written by F.J.T. Stewart, Superintendent of Inspections for the Chicago Underwriters Association, 1,830 people had been in the auditorium where there were seats for 1,602 at the time of the fire. Another 275 were on or about the stage. With an ultimate death toll of 602, there were few positive outcomes, but one that stands out was that of the family of George Thompson, who owned a restaurant adjacent to the theater's entrance. He had purchased tickets to the show for his whole family, but wasn't able to go himself. Learning about the fire while walking near his office on State Street, he ran to the scene, but was blocked from entering the theater by a fireman who told him there wasn't a soul alive inside. Desperate and refusing to give up hope, he tried to enter through a ladder that had been rigged from one of the restaurant's windows into the theater. Upon learning he was there, the restaurant manager appeared and shouted, quote, "All of them got out. They were all in here, and they've gone to your office and are waiting there," unquote. Recounting their experiences at home that night, they learned that Thompson's young daughter, Ruthie, had been crouching under some theater steps when she was lifted up and carried by a stranger to an aid station, where she was found by her Aunt Abby. Abby herself had gotten out safely through a stage door exit. In another seemingly miraculous rescue, Ruthie's little brother John had been swept up by another stranger who lifted him up high and passed him to other adults who got him out through the theater's front doors. Aunt Dot escaped through the front lobby on her own, while Grandpa Holloway had made it out through the stage entrance. Few other accounts of families affected by the Iroquois theater were anywhere nearly as positive as those reflected upon by the Thompsons. News of the tragedy spread quickly all around the world, transmitted by communication technologies of the period. The most recent theater fire, resulting in the highest death toll until then, had occurred December 8, 1881, at the Ring Theater in Vienna, Austria, where 450 had died. Lessons from that disaster were apparently never known or considered by those involved in creating the theater. Among the findings were that exits were not lighted, emergency exits were locked, and an iron proscenium curtain could not be lowered. The reaction to news of the December 30th tragedy was in stark contrast to the hollow boast contained in the 30-page souvenir brochure that was given out to the opening night audience at the Iroquois 5 weeks earlier and in later playbills. In the brochure and public statements attributed to architect Benjamin Marshall, it was emphasized that he had studied every theater disaster in history to avoid errors in the design of the new building, and that it could be emptied in 5 minutes if all the available exits were used. Little, if any, attention had apparently been given to an article 2 months earlier by the editor of a Chicago trade journal called Fireproof Magazine, who had inspected the Iroquois while it was still under construction. Editor William Clendenin noted, quote, "The absence of an intake or stage draft shaft, the exposed reinforcement of the concrete arch above the stage, the presence of wood trim on everything, and the inadequate provision of exits," unquote. If the roof ventilation system had been completed in time, it might have allowed the smoke and fumes from the fire that began on stage to be drawn away from the audience instead of choking many in their seats. When news spread about what happened at the continuously advertised, absolutely fireproof Iroquois Theater, the reaction was almost immediate, even in Europe, where safety shortcomings had resulted in fires with scores of fatalities throughout the 19th century. In Germany's capital city, Kaiser Wilhelm II ordered Berlin's Royal Opera House closed until it could meet new safety standards. He had good reason for concern. In the 1880s alone, there had been a combined loss of more than 1,000 lives in theater fires in Vienna, Austria, Paris and Nice, France, Exeter, England, and Oporto, Portugal. The origins of those fires may have varied, but the causes of death had similar themes: insufficient, sometimes locked or poorly marked exits, stage scenery and lighting prone to combustion, iron proscenium stage curtains that weren't lowered all the way, and audience panic. Among those who escaped the Iroquois Theater alive, many suffered burns or other injuries. An Aurora doctor told of his experience treating some of them in an article he wrote for the April 1958 edition of the Illinois Medical Journal. J.W. Dreyer said he was just finishing 6 months of internship at St. Luke's Hospital at around 3:30 that afternoon when the emergency alarm sounded. Police brought in the first victim, who was badly burned about the head and hands, and while Dreyer was administering first aid, a dozen more similarly afflicted people were brought in. At this point, he summoned all available help, and they were kept busy until late that night. In those days, Dreyer said there was a hospital entrance on Indiana Avenue, and there was a morgue in a rear courtyard. By 5 o'clock that afternoon, hundreds of bodies had been brought to the second floor and arranged in rows to facilitate identification by relatives. Some were so badly disfigured they could be identified only by their jewelry or other personal belongings. In his comprehensive 6-page report, Underwriter Superintendent Stewart went into great detail on how the fire started and spread, the material used in the theater's construction and furnishings, safety features or lack thereof, the failure to train employees on procedures to follow in case of fire, and the failure of city personnel to force postponement of the theater's occupancy until the needed corrections were made. He said, "It would appear that the greatest loss of life was from suffocation by smoke and gases of combustion, and by direct action of the fire, and that a large percentage of the loss is also believed to have been caused by trampling resulted from panic. The report concluded that almost the only part of the facility that could be considered fireproof, as in many other cases, were the walls that formed the framework of the building before the interior features were created and the furnishings put in place. Under the headline, The Lessons of the Chicago Fire, the February 1904 edition of New York's Illustrated Theater magazine published an article with the admonition that, quote, although the horror occurred in Chicago, the disaster might have happened here as well, the conditions in many of our theaters being practically the same, unquote. The same article carried the warning of a recently retired New York fire commissioner that, quote, 3/4 of the theaters in New York are worse fire traps than the Iroquois Theater, unquote. After providing details of what had happened, the article conceded that, quote, nothing can bring back those lives. All we can do is to punish those criminal carelessness made the catastrophe possible and guard against a repetition of it in the future, unquote. As was ultimately the case, it became clear, in fact, that no one was held criminally responsible, though some had their reputations tarnished, lost their jobs, or died sooner than they might have after being publicly shamed for what the reaction helped cause. The underwriter's superintendent of inspections wasn't the only one to criticize Chicago city officials for what they failed to do. Headlines over stories in an extra December 31st edition of the Chicago Journal blared, quote, 3 violations of building laws charged, with some headlines claiming law ignored in building the Iroquois, no harm seen by officials, and coroner is ready for full probe, and another anticipating that he, the coroner, will seek to fix the blame, unquote. The finger pointing clearly went both ways, with another article insinuating Mayor Harrison Jr. was at fault, with 2 sub-headlines claiming, quote, Mayor holds citizens responsible for non-observance of law, blames fate on the Iroquois Theater horror. And this is the mayor's self-defense. Every man believes that an ordinance is a good thing so long as it is not enforced against him or his interests. The fire department clearly did its duty in responding to the fire as soon as a stagehand ran to Engine 13's house for help, but no one refuted Captain Patrick Henning's reaction upon an inspection of the theater days before its official opening. As previously noted, he recognized several violations of public safety that should have been apparent to any city inspector and brought them to the attention of his superior officer with the warning that, quote, if a fire ever starts on that stage, it will be frightful, unquote. Yet nothing was apparently done, either to verify or discredit his findings. The theater opened, and early performances went ahead as scheduled to generally favorable reviews. But barely 5 weeks later, a serious test of the theater's vulnerability was thrust upon it, and it failed completely to meet the challenge. The result was a toll of death in a theater fire that has never been surpassed anywhere to this day. A coroner's inquest began at City Hall on January 7th, 1904, just 8 days after the Iroquois Theater tragedy. The testimony brought out countless contradictory references in regard to individuals who might have borne responsibility for various acts or inaction that had such horrendous consequences. Mayor Harrison accused the city council of not acting quickly enough to approve a proposed new theater ordinance based on a study submitted by the building commissioner on October 19th. The council had suspended action on the ordinance, saying it needed further examination. In not taking immediate action against the numerous theater violations, the mayor said the council, not he, was responsible for the dreadful disaster. The Chicago Inter-Ocean, on the other hand, blamed Harrison for the neglect of his plain duty for days, months, and years, saying he needed no special censure in that he had already been condemned, quote, by the dumb lips of the hundreds dead, unquote. Among other potential fire risks revealed at the inquest were that the stage scenery was made of wood. The so-called asbestos curtain was prevented from dropping to the floor on one side by an electric light reflector that had been left in its path, and that when manila ropes holding up the stage scenery burned, the flammable backdrops came crashing down onto the stage, spreading the flames even farther. As to the individuals most directly involved in the planning, building, and furnishing of the theater, along with allowing it to open despite glaring safety deficiencies, there seems to have been no acceptance of responsibility. To almost everyone with any kind of authority over pieces of the Iroquois tragedy puzzle, the issue in question was either never brought to their attention or someone else was expected to have taken care of it. According to Monroe Fulkerson, the attorney in charge of the fire department's investigation, for example, Thomas Noonan, the theater's business manager, admitted that even though it was one of his responsibilities, he had never instructed anyone, including the head usher, what to do in case of fire, or assigned anyone to manage apparatus for that purpose. He also admitted that 2 ground floor exits on the Randolph Street side of the theater were locked, and that 3 other exits from each of the orchestra level and first and second balconies on the north side of the building were bolted shut during performances. Fulkerson called Noonan's testimony the single most important piece of evidence since his investigation began because it so clearly showed, quote, incompetence and negligence, unquote. According to what he learned from 15 people who had worked on the stage, there had never been a fire drill in the theater, nor were any of the stagehands informed as to the location or use of fire apparatus and the operation of the ventilators over the auditorium and stage. While Noonan corroborated the testimony of other employees about the theater never having had a fire drill, and had never discussed with head usher George Dusenberry about how to prevent loss of life in case of a panic, he assumed Dusenberry knew his business and told House Fireman William Sallers it was his job just to make sure the building complied with city ordinances. Dusenberry claimed his duties were in the auditorium and that the roof ventilators were worked from the stage, which wouldn't have mattered anyway since the ventilator system was never operational. One could conclude, however, that the same testimony Fulkerson referred to as evidence of incompetence and negligence by those responsible for the safe operation of the theater could also have been applied to city officials who were made aware of the theater's inadequate safety features, along with those that appeared not to work, but allowed the theater to open anyway, despite the risk to future audiences. They also apparently failed to inquire about any fire drills or inspections that might have been given to theater employees regarding their specific duties in the event of a fire. It was previously mentioned that the captain of a downtown fire engine company and the chief of the battalion of engine and ladder companies he reported to were both made aware of major deficiencies in the safety features of the Iroquois. Regrettably, in both cases, they were reluctant to force a further delay in the theater's opening until the issues could be resolved because they were concerned such action might affect their chances for future advancement within the department. Surely those threats to public safety that weren't addressed came back to haunt them. Yet a worthy outcome could have been achieved that would have been to the benefit of everyone involved. From the experience of this program's presenter, there may have been a way to force action regarding the theater's serious safety shortcomings without having to worry about repercussions on the job. As a now retired journalist who has been involved with the Chicago Fire Department for over 75 years and as a Chicago Transit Authority media coordinator for the last 28 years of his employment, it was apparent that a battalion chief stationed in the downtown area would routinely be approached by reporters for information about emergency situations that would bring first responders to the scene. As appropriate professional relationships would develop over these fairly frequent occasions, a reporter could learn through casual conversation about a legitimate issue involving public safety that the reporter might want to check out for its potential newsworthiness. And it could all happen without threatening anyone's future job advancement opportunities while potentially saving the lives and property of the people first responders are pledged to serve. It was reported that Benjamin Marshall, the highly praised young architect of the Iroquois, received news of the fire while he was in Pittsburgh and set out quickly for Chicago. Before learning of the locked gates and inadequately identified exit doors in the balconies of the theater, he reiterated his earlier claim that, quote, there were ample fire exits and they were available. The house could have been emptied in less than 5 minutes if they were all utilized. I am completely upset by this disaster, more so because I have built many theaters and have studied every playhouse disaster in history to avoid errors, unquote. Robert McLean, the editor of the trade publication Inland Architect, said he had visited the damaged theater and determined that there was no sign of an asbestos curtain as demanded by city ordinances. No one denies that there was a curtain, he stated, but had it been made of asbestos, it would not have been destroyed by the draft of air as claimed by the house management. He said the stage manager of the Iroquois told him there were only 3 theaters in Chicago equipped with real asbestos drop curtains, but that the Iroquois was not one of them. Other architects and those in other professions offered suggestions in the aftermath of the Iroquois tragedy to head off future such calamities. Calling every theater in Chicago a virtual death trap, even under ordinary conditions, Chicago architect Robert Lindstrom said, quote, all seats throughout the house should be placed far enough apart from back to back so that an open passageway running from aisle to aisle shall be large enough to allow a person to get out without disturbing all the people seated in the section, unquote. With ladies' fashion of the times, including layered skirts, Lindstrom also said seats should be made of iron framework and fixed so the danger of catching clothing on upturned edges of the seats could be averted, which could cause a delay when in a hurry to leave. He considered the seats in the gallery of the Iroquois to have been spaced so closely from back to back that no one could be in a comfortable position at any time. He also recommended that all seats should be made of iron framework with upholstery made of asbestos wool covered by asbestos fire-resistant cloth. Of the 900 people believed to have been seated in the first and second balconies, few were said to have escaped without serious injury due to the intensity of the fire that burned the velvet cushions of the seats bare, the crowds that jammed the exits and trampled many underfoot, and at least one exit that led to an unfinished fire escape where the only way to safety was across an improvised wooden ladder or board that was connected to a building across an alley about 100 feet below. Sadly, many fell to their deaths while trying to use it to reach the other side. Since well before the Iroquois Theater fire, the Chicago Fire Department has issued general orders to all fire companies at the end of each month, listing the deaths, promotions, commendations, and discipline of fire department personnel during that month. Since the Iroquois Theater fire occurred on December 30th, 1903, commendations with details of rescues made at that scene weren't officially recognized until January 31st of 1904. It's noteworthy that the list included John Hannon, chief of the 1st Battalion, who had failed to take action when Engine 13's Captain Patrick Jennings reported finding serious deficiencies in fire safety features at the Iroquois. He was among those commended for their rescue efforts when they responded to the scene, with Hannon himself being credited for rescuing 6 and assisting 12 others to safety from the back of the building. Jennings and 4 pipemen from Engine 13, including Michael J. Corrigan, who was already a 10-year veteran of the department, were commended for rescuing 3 women and 2 children from the theater by leading them to safety on the ladder that was placed horizontally high above the alley between the theater and a building on the other side. Officers and members of Engines 21, 32, and 40 were similarly honored, as were those of Hook and Ladder Company 1. The blistering coroner's jury findings left few officials unscathed. Will Davis, as president and general manager of the Iroquois, quote, failed to see that the theater was properly equipped as required by city ordinances, and to see that his employees were sufficiently drilled for any and all emergencies, unquote. Mayor Carter H. Harrison was castigated for, quote, shirking responsibility as evidenced by the testimony of Building Commissioner George Williams and Fire Marshal William H. Musham as heads of departments under his administration, which has given Chicago inefficient service, making such calamities as the Iroquois Theater horror a menace until the public service is purged of incompetence, unquote. Building Commissioner Williams was cited as, quote, responsible for gross neglect of his duty in allowing the Iroquois Theater to open its doors to the public when the theater was incomplete and did not comply with the requirements of the city's building ordinances, unquote. Edward Laughlin, a building inspector under Williams' authority, was called down for, quote, gross neglect of duty and glaring incompetency in reporting the Iroquois Theater okay after a most superficial inspection, unquote. Fire Marshal William H. Musham was also considered responsible for his, quote, gross neglect of duty in not enforcing city ordinances as they relate to his department, and for failing to have his subordinate, William Sollers, fireman at the Iroquois Theater, report the lack of fire apparatus and appliances as required by law, unquote. Sollers himself was charged with gross neglect of duty in not reporting those same issues, though as a retired fireman, it seems he would have been obligated to report only to his employer rather than to anyone in the fire department. Despite overwhelming evidence of the inadequacy of the firefighting apparatus in the theater and the failure to train employees regarding their responsibilities in the event of a fire, no one connected with the design, construction, furnishing, or operation of the Iroquois was ever really held accountable. As the case progressed, it was determined that liability ceased when plans for the building were approved by the Chicago Building Commissioner, and the structure was turned over to its owners. Those singled out for some degree of negligence or incompetence, leading to the still unsurpassed toll of lives ever lost in a theater fire, made similarly dubious excuses for their actions or inaction prior to the tragedy. While both Will Davis and Harry Powers were partners as the theater's owners, for instance, each referred to the other during separate testimony as the more active manager. Powers reportedly even had the audacity to say the theater had no fire apparatus because it had not been ordered by Salers, the house fireman, as if Salers, perhaps the lowest man on the totem pole of authority, was in a position to tell anyone that there was anything they had to do. Despite the anguish of the hundreds of families forever impacted by the loss of loved ones in the Iroquois theater, the structure itself remained intact. After the interior was cleaned out and refurbished, it was reopened as early as September 1904, becoming Hyde & Beeman's Music Hall, presenting vaudeville-style performances. In 1905, it became a legitimate playhouse once again, renamed the Colonial Theater. After beginning to serve as a motion picture venue in 1913, it was raised in 1924 to make way for an office building with the Oriental Theater occupying the lower levels. It is now called the Nederlander, or literally the Dutchman's Theater. With so many serious allegations of dereliction of responsibility attributed to the major parties involved with the Iroquois theater disaster revealed during the inquest, the theatrical trust that several of the higher-profile individuals owed their livelihoods to sought out a lawyer with the experience to fight the cases against them effectively enough to keep them from being charged for anything beyond what had already been handed down by the court of public opinion. Levi Mayer was practically a perfect fit for that role. Born in Richmond, Virginia, to immigrants from Bavaria and moving with them to Chicago, he graduated from high school at 15, studied at Yale College, and graduated from Yale Law School at 17. Admitted to the Illinois bar at 21, he became a strong advocate for the interests of businessmen and helped found the Illinois Manufacturers Association. In regard to his Iroquois theater entrepreneur clients, Mayer was able to find flaws in existing laws pertaining to liability, got the cases moved to Peoria, where residents' feelings about the tragedy were nowhere nearly as strong as they were in Chicago, and let time itself help weaken interest in the quest for real accountability. Other events in the U.S. and abroad also helped draw attention away from what happened at the Iroquois. Perhaps the most noteworthy disaster following the Iroquois theater fire was a conflagration just over a month later that destroyed some 1,500 buildings in Baltimore, Maryland. The amazing aspect of that fire which was said to have cost over $120 million in property damage, was that not a single life was lost. Within that same general period, the Russo-Japanese War had begun overseas, which eventually won President Teddy Roosevelt a Nobel Peace Prize for having worked to end it. There was also a heavy snowstorm in Chicago in March of 1904 that had a typically paralyzing effect, if only temporarily, on street traffic. And it was also an election year, with the increasingly popular president all but certain to win a full term of his own. Sadly, for Chicago firefighters and today's paramedics, disasters are not always a thing of the past. Barely 7 years after the Iroquois burned, a wall blew out during an extra alarm fire in a cold storage warehouse in the stockyards, killing Fire Marshal James Horan, Assistant Fire Marshal William Burroughs, and 19 other firefighters. It turned out to be the single greatest loss of firefighters in a single incident until September 11th of 2001. And for Chicago as a community, the capsizing of the Eastland in 1915 left 844 in a watery Chicago River grave, including entire families of workers from the Western Electric Company, who had been anticipating an enjoyable summer excursion across Lake Michigan. The ultimate irony of the Eastland disaster was that a significant factor in the ship's questionable seaworthiness could be attributed to the huge loss of life resulting from the sinking of the Titanic just 3 years earlier. Through all of the most traumatic events in downtown Chicago since 1867, Engine 13 has continued to be among the first on the scene, its crews being among the city's most dedicated and effective first responders. Their history provides a good reminder that whether you are downtown or anywhere else, driving or walking, in the city or beyond, be alert when you hear a siren or see flashing red or blue lights ahead of you or in your car's rearview mirror. Think about those who are responding to an emergency and pull over, or look both ways before crossing the street, because it could be someone you know who may be in distress and is anxiously awaiting the services first responders provide.